Night had fallen on a lonely stretch of highway. The rest stop was quiet, just the hum of vending machines, the distant rumble of trucks, and the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. That's when the patrol car pulled in. 2 officers spotted a man standing by his car, stretching his legs. He was black, alone, dressed in plain clothes, and that, in their eyes, was enough. They didn't see a citizen. They didn't see a man who had driven for hours, exhausted. They saw a suspect. In minutes, handcuffs snapped shut. A man's dignity shattered on cold concrete. But the next morning, those same officers would walk into a courtroom, only to find their suspect sitting on the bench as the judge. The night before it all happened, Judge Anthony Carter was simply a man on the road. No robe, no gavel, no courtroom prestige. Just Anthony, 52 years old, tired from the weight of a week filled with hearings, and on his way home from visiting his mother. The highway stretched endlessly before him. His playlist hummed through the speakers, soft jazz, the kind of music that quiets a restless mind. It was near midnight when his eyelids grew heavy. So, at the next rest stop, he pulled over. A simple decision. A pause for safety. Nothing more. The rest area was deserted except for a truck idling on the far side. The fluorescent lights flickered. He stepped out, stretched, breathed in the cool night air. It felt good, freedom from the closed cabin of the car. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled through a few texts, and leaned against the hood. Then came the sound. Tires crunching gravel. A patrol cruiser pulling in fast, headlights sweeping across the lot like searchlights. Anthony didn't move. He had nothing to fear. Or so he thought. The doors swung open. 2 officers stepped out, their movements sharp, rehearsed. Their eyes locked on him as if he were already guilty of something. "Evening, sir," one called, his hand resting a little too easily on the grip of his holstered weapon. Anthony nodded. "Evening, officers." "Just stretching my legs." But suspicion had already written itself across their faces. "What are you doing out here this late?" the other asked, his voice clipped, more interrogation than courtesy. "I told you. Driving home. Needed to rest for a bit." The first officer took a step closer, scanning Anthony from head to toe, noticing his well-tailored coat, his polished shoes, his calm composure. Yet none of it mattered. In their eyes he didn't belong. "License and registration?" one demanded. Anthony felt the sting of it. Not the request itself, but the tone. He'd been stopped before. Questioned before. But there was something different tonight. An edge of hostility in their stance, as if his mere presence was provocation. He opened his wallet, handed them his license. They didn't glance at the name, didn't register who he was. They only saw skin color, not credentials. "Step away from the car?" "For what reason?" Anthony asked, his voice steady but firm. That was enough. Within seconds, one officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, while the other reached for cuffs. Anthony's chest hit the hood with a thud. Metal bit into his wrists. The humiliation burned deeper than the pain. Here he was, stripped of dignity in a place meant for rest. Treated as a threat when all he wanted was peace. They searched him, searched his car, muttering accusations under their breath. Trespassing, suspicion of theft, loitering. Excuses stacked up, flimsy as paper, each one thinner than the last. Anthony said little. He'd learned long ago that words often meant nothing when ears refused to hear. The officers kept him cuffed as they radioed dispatch. Their voices were laced with a satisfaction he recognized all too well, the smugness of power unchecked. Minutes dragged into half an hour. Then finally, after their search turned up nothing, after their attempts to pin him to some invisible crime failed, they released him. But not with apology. Not with humility. They tossed his license onto the hood, muttering, "You can go." As if they were granting him freedom he already owned. Anthony picked up his license, his hands trembling. Not from fear, from anger. From the familiar wound of being reduced to nothing but suspicion. He got back into his car, closed the door, and sat there, silent, breathing deeply. This was not new, this was not surprising. Yet it cut deep every time. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was who he was. By dawn, those same officers would be standing in a courtroom, summoned for misconduct. Their arrogance from the night before would curdle into disbelief when they realized the man they had shoved, cuffed, and humiliated was Judge Anthony Carter, the one presiding over their hearing. But that twist, destiny's sharp turn, was still hours away. For now, Anthony drove on, headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying the weight of centuries of injustice in his chest. He knew tomorrow would bring more than routine. Tomorrow would demand a reckoning. Morning light poured through the courthouse windows, gilding the marble floors with streaks of gold. Judge Anthony Carter walked through the halls, robe draped neatly over his arm, his briefcase in hand. To everyone else, it was just another day in the justice system. But to Anthony, it was something else entirely. He'd barely slept. His mind replayed the night over and over. The flashing lights, the handcuffs, the way those officers looked at him like prey. Every detail was etched into memory. The weight of it lingered, pressing against his chest like a stone. Still, when he entered the chambers, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. That was his armor. The robe, the posture, the measured tone, symbols of authority that reminded others, and himself, that he was more than the assumptions thrown at him in a parking lot. The docket for the day was full. A few civil disputes, some minor criminal hearings, and then, tucked halfway down the list, an internal affairs case. 2 officers facing disciplinary review for procedural misconduct. Anthony scanned the names. His breath caught, his jaw tightened. It was them. The very same officers who had shoved him against his own car less than 12 hours ago. The irony was cruel. The system that shielded them was now delivering them into his courtroom. Not as enforcers of law, but as defendants. By mid-morning, the courtroom filled. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks arranged files, and a few reporters scribbled notes. The public benches held family members, curious citizens, and officers from the same department. Whispers buzzed in the air, hushed speculation about what might unfold. Then, the doors opened. The 2 officers walked in, their uniforms crisp, their chins high. They carried themselves with the same arrogance Anthony remembered, the kind of arrogance born from a lifetime of unchecked authority. But when their eyes rose to the bench, when they saw him, their confidence cracked. It was a flicker at first, confusion, recognition, and then unmistakable fear, because sitting high above them, in the black robe of justice, was the man they had arrested, the man they had dismissed, the man they had called suspicious, Judge Anthony Carter. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. You could hear the shifting of papers, the faint cough of a reporter, the officers' shallow breaths. Anthony's gaze was steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply looked at them, eyes sharp, posture unyielding. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice carrying like thunder through the chamber. The proceedings began. The allegations were laid out: wrongful detainment, excessive use of force, abuse of authority. The defense attorneys tried to soften it, painting the incident as misunderstanding, an overreaction, during routine patrol. But every word rang hollow, especially in Anthony's ears, because he knew the truth, he had lived it. As the testimonies unfolded, Anthony sat in silence, his expression unreadable. Witnesses spoke. Reports were read. Every detail of the officer's misconduct was dragged into the light. The officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, their earlier bravado melting into unease. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him. And in that courtroom, for once, the power dynamics shifted. No longer could they hide behind badges or rehearsed excuses. No longer could they treat a black man as disposable. Because here he was, holding the gavel. Anthony listened carefully, taking notes, maintaining the impartial facade that justice demanded. But inside, he was wrestling with something deeper, an anger tempered by years of experience, and a responsibility greater than himself. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man who had been cuffed for nothing. every woman who had been dismissed, every child who had been told they didn't belong. The courtroom wasn't just a stage for procedure today, it was a battlefield for dignity. By the end of the session, tension filled every corner of the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Observers sat frozen, knowing they were witnessing something rare, accountability in real time. And the officers. Their silence was louder than any excuse. They sat there, stripped of the confidence they once wore like armor, now exposed before the very system they thought they controlled. Judge Anthony Carter looked at them one last time, before adjourning for the day. His words were measured, deliberate. "This court will resume tomorrow for deliberations." The gavel struck. Echoes rippled through the chamber. As people filed out, whispers followed about fate, about irony, about justice finally staring arrogance in the face. Anthony remained seated a moment longer, staring at the empty courtroom. He knew tomorrow would bring the breaking point. Not just for the officers, but for himself. Because the hardest question still remained, would he deliver judgment as a man wronged, or as a judge sworn to impartiality? That choice, the line between justice and vengeance, loomed closer with every passing minute. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. Word had spread overnight. Reporters with cameras lined the steps. Protesters held signs about police accountability. Inside, the benches filled with community members, civil rights advocates, and officers who wore uniforms like shields. Judge Anthony Carter walked into the courtroom with the same calm stride as always. But inside, a storm brewed. His chest was heavy, his thoughts torn between duty and the raw wound of humiliation. The two officers sat at the defense table, their eyes darting nervously. Their confidence from the night of the arrest was gone, replaced with a jittery unease. They whispered to their lawyer, stealing glances at the man who now controlled their fate. The clerk called the court to order. Anthony lifted his gavel. The sound of wood striking wood silenced the room. The hearing resumed. Testimonies poured in, accounts from other citizens, prior complaints buried in departmental paperwork, recordings that painted a pattern too consistent to ignore. Each piece of evidence stacked higher, a tower of truth closing in on the officers. But with every word, Anthony's mind tugged in two directions. On one side, the personal memory of last night, the sting of steel cuffs, the taste of powerlessness. It urged him toward anger, toward retribution. It whispered, "They humiliated you." On the other side, the oath he had taken as a judge. To uphold the law without bias. To ensure fairness, even for those who denied it to others. That voice whispered, "If you fail this test, you're no better than them." The tension was unbearable. He gripped the gavel tighter, his knuckles white. His eyes shifted between the evidence before him and the two men who had mocked his humanity. At one point, their lawyer stood and argued passionately. "Your Honor, my clients acted within their discretion. They were doing their jobs, protecting the community. There was no malicious intent." Anthony's jaw clenched. The words stung because he had heard them too many times before. Words that excused violence. Words that masked prejudice under the cloak of procedure. Then, like a cruel echo, his mind replayed the moment at the rest stop. The officer's voice. Step away from the car. The shove against metal. The way they didn't see him, not as a man, not as a citizen, but as a threat. A quiet voice inside him asked, "What would happen if you weren't a judge? What if you were just another man, cuffed, beaten, forgotten?" The courtroom blurred for a moment. He saw not just himself, but generations of black men before him, faces in mugshots, names on forgotten dockets, bodies lost in the cracks of justice. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaled deeply, then opened them again. Duty, integrity, balance. These were the pillars that had carried him this far. He would not let anger topple them. But then came the moment. The prosecutor requested the officers take the stand. Reluctantly, they did. Under oath, their stories wavered. Their arrogance crumbled. And when asked if they had recognized the man they detained, their silence betrayed them. They hadn't seen him at all. Not truly. They admitted to profiling, though dressed in bureaucratic language. They admitted to escalating without cause, though they called it safety protocol. Their words were a confession wrapped in denial. The courtroom felt the weight of it. Reporters scribbled faster. Spectators leaned forward. The air was thick, electric, waiting for Anthony's reaction. And in that moment, Anthony Carter reached his breaking point, not with rage, but with clarity. He realized this was bigger than him. Bigger than two officers. Bigger than one night at a rest stop. This was about a system that empowered arrogance and punished innocence. A cycle that would never end unless someone, somewhere, broke it. His voice cut through the room, calm, steady, heavy with meaning. "This court will recess before my ruling," he said. The gavel struck. The sound reverberated like a heartbeat through the chamber. As people shuffled out, Anthony remained seated, staring at the empty tables. For the first time in years, he allowed the weight of his own humanity to surface. The cuffs. The shame. The choice he had to make, not vengeance. Not mercy, justice. But what kind of justice? By stepping away from the bench, he gave himself space to decide, not as a man humiliated, but as a judge entrusted with truth. The breaking point had come, and now, the decision would define everything. The courthouse buzzed like a hive when Judge Anthony Carter returned after recess. The air carried a tension that could be cut with a knife. Everyone knew the weight of the moment. Everyone knew this wasn't just another disciplinary hearing. It had become a stage where justice itself was on trial. Anthony walked to the bench, robe flowing behind him like a mantle of responsibility. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room. Every eye was on him. Some expected outrage. Others expected leniency. Few understood the storm raging inside. He tapped his gavel lightly. "This court is back in session." The prosecutor delivered closing remarks first. She spoke with precision, laying out how the officers had overstepped their authority, how their conduct reflected bias rather than professionalism, how this wasn't an isolated mistake but part of a troubling pattern. Her voice rose with passion. No citizen should be treated as a criminal for resting at a rest stop. No officer should wear a badge if they cannot distinguish between suspicion and prejudice. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Then came the defense. The lawyer's tone was firm but defensive, clinging to the same tired refrain. These officers acted in good faith. They responded to circumstances that appeared unusual. To punish them severely would be to discourage vigilance in law enforcement. But his words sounded hollow against the backdrop of evidence, against the reality sitting in the judge's memory. Anthony listened without expression, though his chest tightened. He remembered the cold hood of his car, the snap of metal cuffs, the hollow excuses. Their vigilance had been his humiliation. Finally, it was the officer's turn to speak. One of them, Officer Daniels, stood, his voice quivering with a mix of shame and defiance. "Your Honor, we didn't know who you were." "If we had?" Anthony's eyes flashed. His voice cut like steel. "If you had known I was a judge, you would have treated me differently." "Is that what you're saying?" The courtroom went silent. Daniels swallowed hard, realizing his mistake. "No, sir. I mean," he faltered, searching for words. But none came. Anthony leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You should treat every person with the dignity you would give a judge. Every citizen deserves that respect, regardless of title or robe. You failed in that duty?" Gasps echoed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching like thunder. The other officer, Ramirez, tried to recover. His words stumbled out, defensive, fragile. "We didn't mean harm, Your Honor. We just thought." Anthony raised a hand, silencing him. "You thought wrong. And in that wrong, you revealed something larger than yourselves." He paused, scanning the courtroom, letting his words sink in. "This is not simply about two men making a poor decision. It is about a culture that teaches men with badges that suspicion is justified when the skin is dark. It is about the arrogance that power breeds when it goes unchecked." The silence that followed was heavy, reverent. Even the officers lowered their eyes. Anthony's voice softened, but carried weight. Last night, you stripped me of dignity. But I sit here not as your victim, not as your equal, but as your judge. And that is not irony. That is justice staring you in the face. The courtroom felt the gravity of his words. Reporters exchanged looks, realizing they were witnessing history. Justice personified in restraint, in clarity, in truth spoken from the bench. Anthony knew his choice would echo beyond these walls. If he ruled with vengeance, headlines would paint him as biased, emotional, compromised. If he ruled with too much leniency, he would betray not only himself, but every citizen who had endured the same humiliation. So he walked the narrow line. This court finds that both officers engaged in misconduct unbecoming of their position. Your actions violated the trust placed in you by this community. The penalties will be determined according to statute and departmental guidelines. But let this be clear, this court will not tolerate bias disguised as duty. Not today. Not ever. The gavel struck. The sound cracked through the chamber like lightning. Reactions erupted instantly. Some cheered, others wept. Officers whispered in tight circles. Reporters rushed for the door to file their stories. The officers sat pale and silent, stripped not by handcuffs, but by accountability. For once, their power had limits. Anthony remained still, his hand resting on the gavel. His heart pounded, but his face betrayed nothing. He had chosen restraint over rage, justice over vengeance. But when the courtroom emptied, when the noise faded, he sat alone on the bench, staring into the quiet. The robe felt heavier than ever. The decision had cost him something invisible, part of his spirit, part of his humanity. Because justice, he knew, was never clean. It was messy, complicated, painful, and demanded sacrifice. And today, the sacrifice had been his own anger. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and whispered to himself, "Dignity above all." The words echoed in the empty chamber. The case had ended, but the story was only beginning. By the next morning, headlines spread across newspapers and television screens. Judge presides over officers who arrested him. The story traveled beyond the courthouse, beyond the state, beyond borders. It became a symbol of irony, of justice, of the fragile line between power and abuse. Judge Anthony Carter's name became known, but not for his titles or past rulings. It was for that one night at a rest stop, and the morning after, when the gavel of justice found its truest weight. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some carried signs of solidarity, praising his composure. Others demanded deeper reform, angry that the officers would face only departmental penalties, rather than criminal charges. The air was electric with both admiration and unrest. Anthony walked through those crowds in silence. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached toward him. Reporters shouted questions. "Your Honor, do you think justice was served? Do you regret not stepping down from the case? Was your ruling influenced by personal experience?" He gave no answer. He simply walked, each step measured, his robe tucked neatly under his arm. The cameras captured the image, a man carrying the burden of justice on his shoulders. At home, the silence was different. His living room was filled with flowers and letters delivered by strangers. Messages of gratitude. Testimonies from people who had been through the same humiliation, but never had the power to respond. Words like, "You spoke for us. You carried our voice. You gave us dignity." Anthony read each one slowly. Some he read twice. Others brought him to tears. He thought of the countless stories untold, the names that never made headlines. For every Anthony Carter, there were thousands who were silenced, forgotten, erased. One evening, he sat at his desk and wrote in his journal. His handwriting was steady, deliberate. Justice is not a robe. It is not a gavel. It is not even the law. Justice is the ability to stand a humiliation and still choose dignity. Justice is restraint when anger burns hottest. Justice is not perfect, but it is necessary. The trial's outcome reverberated through the department. Officers whispered among themselves, some defensive, others shaken. For the first time, they had to look at one of their own and see consequence. It was not enough to break the system, but it was enough to crack its armor. Weeks later, Anthony returned to the rest stop, same highway, same hum of vending machines, same flickering fluorescent light. He stood by his car, the memory pressing against him like a shadow. But this time he was not a man cuffed and humiliated. He was a man who had stood in the fire and chosen dignity. He looked out at the empty lot and whispered, "You did not break me." The words weren't for the officers. They were for himself. A reminder that power doesn't always come from authority. It comes from refusing to be reduced to less than human. As he drove away, the city behind him, the highway stretching ahead, Anthony knew his story had become something larger than his own pain. It had become a mirror for the country. A question posed to every citizen, every officer, every judge. What kind of justice will we choose when prejudice stands at the door? The rest stop had been a place of humiliation. But the courtroom became a place of reckoning. And in the balance between the two, a new chapter of justice had been written. Judge Anthony Carter carried that chapter not as a victory, but as a burden. Because he knew this was only one story, and tomorrow there would be another. In the end, what happened to Judge Anthony Carter was more than irony. It was a collision between arrogance and accountability, between prejudice and principle. Two officers believed they could strip a man of dignity in the shadows of a rest stop. Instead, they found themselves standing in the brightest light of justice. But Anthony's story is not just about a single night or a single courtroom. It's about a choice. The choice to wield power with restraint. The choice to answer humiliation not with vengeance, but with dignity. The choice to remember that justice is not measured by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat the most ordinary among us. The gavel that struck that day echoed beyond the walls of the courthouse. It echoed in the hearts of those who had been silenced, reminding them that truth can still rise, even in the face of prejudice. And it leaves us with a question. When authority and bias collide, will we look away? Or will we demand a justice that sees every person fully, without disguise, without excuse? Because the measure of any society is not in its laws alone, but in the courage of those who enforce them, and those who refuse to bend beneath them. This was more than a trial. It was a reminder, a warning, and a hope. You've been watching everyday racism drama,